Alrighty, good morning everybody. I want to make sure everyone's awake, so I'm going to ask, are you all awake? All right, okay, so I don't have to make you dance. Okay, good. I was going to channel Chris, but I think we're all here ready to go. So yeah, thank you for being here. This is going to be my more expanded talk this year. Last year I talked about packetization, and in that presentation I had a slide kind of talking about liquidity. And when I made that presentation, I thought liquidity really deserves its own talk. And this year I was looking for a topic. I was like, why not dive deep into this liquidity issue? And I think liquidity is just a very incredibly important thing to understand and talk about as we're trying to design payment systems. And I don't know if there's like one big message in this presentation. It's a little bit more just kind of just giving you a bunch of different things to think about and different things to take away from this talk. All good? All right. All right. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to define what is liquidity, and don't take this so much as the official academic definition. I dropped out of college, so go to someone else for that. But it's my interpretation. It's a model that I use, and I think it's very useful. So hopefully you'll find it useful as well. I want to talk about some historical anecdotes or tidbits about liquidity. I think liquidity is something that's very powerful, but often kind of under the surface and not something people think about a lot. But it does affect our lives and our day-to-day all the time. And then, of course, this is the Interledger conference, so we are going to talk about liquidity within Interledger. I'm still working on DOSI, which is a peer-to-peer implementation of Interledger. And within that, I have some news or some new ideas around liquidity, which I want to share. So let's jump in. So what is liquidity? So liquidity relates to value. So for me, value can exist in a number of different forms, and liquidity means that you can move and transform it. So to me, liquidity is the ability to move value. So if you have liquidity, that means you can take that value that you have, that someone else has, and you can move it and you can transform it. And how can you transform it? Well, you can move it through space. So if I have money in my account, I can send it to you. It's liquidity. I can get the money from me to you. If I have money in the United States and that money is liquid, I can send it to another country. It's liquid. So that's one way that liquidity can move assets. Another one is through time. So I have dollars that are coming in 2 months. Like let's say I'm a manufacturer of some widget, and I know that my customer is going to pay me once I ship them the widgets. But that's not going to happen for 2 months. And so I have this money that's in the future, and I need to bring that money back in time to today. And we don't have time machines, but we do have time machines for money, and that's called borrowing and lending. And so I can actually have somebody give me the money today, and then I promise to give them the money later. And so then I have the money to buy all the inputs so I can actually make the widgets, so I can ship them to my customer and get paid. So that's also liquidity, right? Like if I have no creditworthiness, I can't borrow the money, I'm not as liquid, and that affects how I can run my business. And then, of course, the last type of liquidity that I think about is transforming value from one type to another. So that might be going from one currency to another currency. Some currencies might be more liquid than others. And so if it's less liquid, I might lose more money as I'm trying to convert. Same thing if I wanted to sell my couch. My couch is probably less liquid than euros would be. So there are different assets, and they need liquidity to be converted, transformed, moved through time and space. So as I was working on this presentation, this is all very abstract, but I got this message yesterday. And it's from a good friend of mine, and she was telling me about something that's going on in the Philippines right now. There's a horrible typhoon, and it's affecting an area that was just affected by earthquakes. And so she sent this very heartfelt message to ask for help. And attached to that message was a QR code to donate. And so I scanned the QR code, and it said it was for a Puerto Rican mobile wallet, which I didn't have. And so it started to try to walk me through onboarding to a mobile wallet, and I was like, I want to help, but I don't necessarily want this new mobile wallet. So I was like, and I didn't even know if I could sign up for that because I'm not a resident of Puerto Rico. So I wasn't sure like how to go about it. So then I was like, okay, let me just Google, how to help with a typhoon in the Philippines. And so it took me to the website of the Philippine Red Cross, and they had this flyer, which is specifically about this typhoon that's going on right now. And on that flyer, they have Gcash, that's this QR code right here. And then they have Maya, which is this QR code right here. And when you scan these are not websites. These are just like an encoded string. So you have to actually have these apps to be able to scan these. And clearly, it's only for people that actually live in the Philippines. Like, I kind of looked at it. You might be able to sign up not being from the Philippines. But again, you probably don't want to have a mobile wallet in every country, So I was like, OK, what else is there? There's down here, it says bank deposit. OK, that might be useful. But if I send a bank wire today, it's not going to get there for days, So I want to help right now, And being a professional in the payments world, I'm kind of like, OK, what else can I do? So I can't do these mobile wallets. The bank wire is slow. But hey, there are these money transmitters. There are these companies you can go to, money transmitting organizations, and they have accounts in each country, and they can maybe put something in that bank account instantly. Because in the Philippines, they have InstaPay. So this is what I'm trying to do. I've got my account. I don't actually have a Mexican bank account, but for simplicity, I'm just assuming I have. And then in the Philippines, there's the bank that the Philippine Red Cross is using. And so I'm trying to move value, right? So I need liquidity. Now, that exact direct liquidity doesn't exist, at least not with the time constraint of now, right? I could use something like Swift, but I want it now. So I was thinking, OK, maybe let me use one of these online MTOs. So the way that works is that they have a presence in Mexico, and then you can use SPAY to do an instant transfer to the Mexican bank account for the MTO. And then they have an account in the Philippines, and they can instantly pay out from that account. So that, in principle, could work. But of course, there's more that happens under the hood that you as a user don't necessarily notice. But we as professionals, we know. So there is a US correspondent, so at some point, they will take the Mexican pesos and they'll probably convert them to dollars. I mean, they might do something else, but probably. There may also be an additional correspondent in Asia, so Singapore, for example. And that might all happen in the background, and that's not going to be instant. So that's going to happen later. So they're going to pay out immediately, but then actually for them to get the money back, it's going to be later. So really, that's not now. That should be a couple days later. So I'm just putting T+2 as like 2 days later, 3 days later. And OK, so they get it later. And so there is a little bit of time traveling in here too, right? So they're essentially lending me the money in the Philippines, and then like eventually they'll get it back. And that's kind of how it would work in theory. So I can get my money instantly to the Philippines. The victims can get their disaster relief. Everyone is happy. Of course, we don't live in this fantasy world where everything goes smoothly. In reality, I tried to make the transfer, and then it said if transfer was paused, and it asked me what typhoon meant. Apparently, there's probably some sort of sanctioned entity or something that's called Typhoon. And so when I put the memo, support for victims of Typhoon Tino, it got flagged by the money transmitter, and they said, first they asked me, is Typhoon a person, a business, or an organization, or something else? So I said something else, and I described what is a typhoon. And then they said, cool, we will probably get the money there by Sunday. And I'm like, the whole reason I use you guys instead of a bank wire is because it's supposed to be instant. So anyway, in their defense, they did later that night send me an update and say that they paid it out. So thankfully, the victims got their relief on time. But I still kept it in the presentation because I think it makes the point that like payments is a huge headache and it is ridiculous. And every time I give a presentation, something like this happens, and I can just talk about it. So clearly, we are solving real problems. OK, so let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that happens here in the background to make all this possible. So to get from one currency to another, there's somebody who provides that liquidity. In that case, would be a FX market maker. And so that's an example for a liquidity provider who converts type, so from one type of asset to the other. someone who helps transfer funds across borders. There are like many different liquidity providers I could list. One type would be a correspondent bank. So a bank that has accounts with other banks, or other banks have accounts with them, and so they facilitate the movement of funds across borders. And of course, banks may do both. You know, they might also be FX market makers, etc. I already mentioned this example of like if you want to move funds through time, that's borrowing, lending. So you know, again, banks do that as well. So banks are popping up a lot when you're talking about liquidity, and that is certainly not by accident. Now, to do all these things, like to be a FX market maker, to be a correspondent bank, to be a lender borrower, you need a couple of things. You obviously need licensing, compliance, operations, but you also need capital. You need assets, and that is because a lot of times the way liquidity provision works is that you essentially have to give money or guarantee money before you actually get it, before it actually fully settles. And so that's the assets that you're using. So for example, if you're an FX market maker, you need to have both of the currencies that you're trading with, or all of the currencies that you're trying to trade, so that you can pay somebody who wants to buy one, and then you accumulate the other one, and then eventually you have to trade with someone else. So you need these assets. And then the other option is, if you don't have any assets and you still want to be a liquidity provider, you can also do it on credit. So sometimes, there will be two banks and they will extend credit to each other, or a central bank will extend credit to their banks based on collateral that they've posted. But in all of these cases, being a liquidity provider is expensive. The assets have an opportunity cost. You're not lending them out. You're not investing in something else. So that is a real cost, and it's actually one of the costs that's driving, especially cross-currency, cross-border payments. The cost of liquidity is a significant part. And then, of course, if you're borrowing, it has a similar cost, a percentage that you have to pay when you're borrowing money. And so, that's one of the primary costs in liquidity. It's the cost of capital. I also mentioned operations. So you're going to have, compliance team that do these very useful risk checks, so that someone mentions typhoon, the payment gets flagged. You also have to deal with inventory risk. So for example, if you're an FX market maker and you're trading between two currencies and one of them takes a nosedive, well, you take a loss. And that is something that you have to be thinking about, and a cost you have to recuperate somehow. Adverse selection cost is a really fun one. Also affects market makers. And that refers to the fact that you don't choose the time of when you trade and what you trade. Someone else chooses that. And so that someone else might have more knowledge. They might know that central bank is going to make an announcement tomorrow. They might know that there's a liquidity crisis about to happen. And so that's another cost you have to bear if you want to be a liquidity provider and you're constantly available to do transactions. People will pick their time to transact with you, and that will show up in your books as a loss. So if liquidity is really useful, but it's also really expensive, what that means is we have to be very efficient with it. It's a valuable resource. And so we want to have the most amount of payments that we can process with the least amount of assets and liquidity that we provide. And so that is something that I think about all the time, is like, when we're building payment protocols, like how do we use whatever liquidity exists efficiently? It's great to have more liquidity. It's great to have different techniques, but it's really about like what is out there already, what are people already using, and how can we leverage that? One mistake I see that's being made a lot is kind of asking people to build a complete parallel system. So, there's already banks out there. They already have a bunch of liquidity deployed. And so trying to build a system that's entirely outside of that and uses completely separate liquidity is very inefficient. And so it's best if you can use all the existing liquidity, all the existing channels as much as you possibly can, and then build on top of that. So let me talk a little bit about how liquidity has shaped history and some different, things I find interesting when I look at that. So one of my favorite historical quotes, and this is, kind of outing me as a bit of an amateur economist geek, is this quote from Marco Polo, where he's like traveling in China, and this is during the Mongol Empire time. And so he's fascinated by the concept of paper money. And it's not necessarily the first instance of paper money ever, but it's very early for paper money. And so he kind of says, like, yeah, so these pieces are being issued with this great solemnity and great importance, as if they were gold or silver. And then they have these very important officials that put their seal on them. And what this is, paper money, is when it's no longer redeemable for commodities, or it's no longer fully backed, I should say, it's essentially kind of free liquidity, right? Like you can have a lot of these paper bills, and they can be used in trade and exchange, and they don't cost very much to produce. So it's an interesting kind of hack, and really money is in a very unique place among liquidity assets. One thing I would say is that a lot of times, once somebody has that power to create liquidity from nothing, they tend to do it too much. And so Marco Polo says, the Khan causes every year to me such a vast quantity of this money, which costs him nothing, that it must be equal in amount to all the treasure in the world. And yeah, sure enough, that thing went hyperinflation eventually. So that just tends to happen. At some point, people are just like getting a little too excited about the free money, and this happens. This is actually one of the things where I'm sort of split on where cryptocurrency is ultimately going to go, because the promise of cryptocurrency, of course, is that it's also unbacked free money, but it's supposed to be limited, right? There's supposed to be a limited supply, and there's not supposed to be a great Khan who can just decide to print more. But at the end of the day, having been part of a lot of cryptocurrency communities, like it's still run by people, right? Like you still make changes to the protocol from time to time, and it's not inconceivable that some future generation could look at Bitcoin and say, hey, let's make a few more because I missed out on when the original ones were issued. It's pretty far away today. I don't think we're anywhere close to that happening. I think everyone would be against it right now, or almost everyone. But at the same time, like if you're really thinking long term, you're thinking, is this the future of money? You have to decide, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? And I don't know the future, so I can't tell you. But if it doesn't happen, I think cryptocurrency is a very interesting form of money. And if it does happen, I think it'll go the way of this piece of paper here. Here's another picture. Anybody want to guess like where in the world this might be, or what time period? Just shout it out. Amsterdam. Nice. If someone else got it too, I heard it from over there. So this is the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the first stock exchange in the world. And so what a stock exchange does is it basically allows you to put your money into a business venture and still not have it tied up in there. You can just literally sell your stock the next day and go put it towards something else. And so it gives you liquidity for your stock in a way that didn't really exist before. And what that does is it makes people a lot more interested in putting their money into businesses, right? And I'm not a historian, so you should definitely not take my word for it, but it is interesting that the society that came up with some of these financial innovations, like the first stock exchange, then had a lot of global influence in what we call the Dutch Empire. Not a fan of empires, I should say, but I think it is interesting how much power and how much economic efficiency can be derived just from like an idea, like, oh, we could put these pieces of paper and we could trade them, and like it represents like a piece of this company. I just think it's very fascinating because it makes me think about like what else is out there that we haven't discovered yet. Like what is there, like some financial engineering thing that would actually make our economy vastly more efficient that we just haven't thought of? So I always find that very fascinating. This is another old building. I'll let you guess again. Anybody? Speak up. London, yes, London. And what is it? Which building? Bank of England. Thank you. Very good. See, this is a group of experts. I love it. Okay, so what's the Bank of England notable for? And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Like you read through the Wikipedia article, and then you're kind of like, okay, let me just read that again. Like, okay, so it has something to do with government debt being more liquid. They are the first to do what we nowadays call open market operations. So it's kind of like, buying government bonds and selling government bonds and creating liquidity, acting as a market maker in that. And then that allowed the government to borrow way more money and way more consistently and at lower interest rates. And what can you do if you can borrow more money way more consistently at way lower interest rates? Well, you can have a big empire. So there's another empire that started from that. So again, still not in favor of empires, but it is, once again, interesting what you can do when you have readily available liquidity. This is kind of more of a little bonus for you guys. While I was researching the British Empire, I found this little map. I think it's from 1903. And so I'm going to just zoom in because it's a little bit small. But all these little red lines are undersea telegraph cables. And honestly, this doesn't look that different from when you look at like an undersea internet cable map today. And it's crazy to think that we had this like 100 years ago. And so I think another thing that made the British Empire so global and so powerful is that they could do these like trade across borders and like instant communication, basically say like, hey, I want to order this much steel and whatnot. And eventually you get like Western Union, so you'd also like wire money over telegraph. So I think it's very interesting. The other thing that I thought about when I saw this was, how much the world still changed when we went from this to the internet. Even though like you could look at it and say like, well, this is basically, I mean, it's not as efficient as the internet, and maybe we can't like tweet or whatever. But like, you can still communicate, so it should be like 80% of the way there. Like you can still send important messages when you need to. But the internet is still such a different thing. And so the reason that struck me is because sometimes that comes up in the context of Interledger, where we talk about Interledger and we say, hey, it's like global interoperability and it connects all the world's payment systems. And then people will say, but they're already connected. And it's like, yeah, they're already connected, but it's kind of like this. It's like they're connected in this clunky way with slow throughput, and you have to have a certain amount of money you're trying to send to make it even worth it. And there's fees and it's slow and so on. And so what we're really trying to do is like take this current state of the world with the telegraph of payments and take it to like things like packetization and instant packets of money that we can send around the world. So I do think there's sort of still a step change that would happen if Interledger really became adopted. Well, speaking of Interledger, I want to talk a little bit about how does liquidity play into Interledger. And the number one first thing that I want to explain, or really, okay, I said there wasn't the one takeaway. If there is one takeaway, it's this, which is Interledger is trying to be a universal protocol for payments. And so by definition, almost, any liquidity you put into Interledger is universal liquidity. So what do I mean by that? So today, a lot of liquidity is either completely proprietary, or it's at least use case specific. So what do I mean by that? So proprietary liquidity would be that MTO I mentioned earlier. They have money that's sitting around the world in their accounts, and that can only be used for customers of that specific MTO. Nobody else can use that. You could take an example of like a big corporate, and they have money pre-funded around the world in their treasury operations to pay vendors and pay employees. And that capital, that money, can only be used by that specific company. And so that, again, if I take an analogy from the communications world, that's sort of like the days where we had like a broadcast cable network, which was only for TV. And then we had a phone network, which was only for phone calls. And then we had a telegraph network and what are those little beepers called, like just pagers? A pager network that was different than the phone network. It's just like you have all these different networks out there, and they're all in parallel, and they're all global, but they're not, you can't use one for the other. You can't, And so then the internet came along and said, like, well, we just have this primitive for communication, which is like sending a little packet of data, and it doesn't matter if that packet is for a phone call or a Netflix video or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter. We're really good at sending packets, and so any kind of communication you want to do, you can do over this. And so the internet came to replace a lot of these other communication networks, because why would you run 5 different cables to your house if you could just run one internet cable? And like nowadays, more and more people are switching to just, I don't have a phone line anymore at home. I don't know about you guys, but so. And that's not really happened with payments at all. I think with payments, it's still very much like, oh, this money is for remittances. Oh, this money is for corporate payments. Oh, this is for that. The closest we have is probably correspondent banking, because a lot of other use cases will eventually settle up using correspondent banking, right? So you could say that is universal liquidity, but it's still only a fraction of the total liquidity in the system. And especially when it comes to trying to do things real time, we almost always rely on additional liquidity on top of that, which is very inefficient and redundant. And then, of course, last year I talked about packetization, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I do want to recap some of the benefits of packetization, specifically as it applies to liquidity. One is that when you're providing liquidity in the traditional payment system, usually you're going to be targeting a specific size payment. So you might either be providing liquidity for retail payments, so you're going to be dealing with like, couple $100, maybe a few thousand. Or you're going to be providing liquidity for corporate payments and banks. And then you're talking about millions, tens of millions. And so as a liquidity provider, you're probably going to be specialized one way or the other. And so one of the key things about packetization is that a big payment and a small payment look the same. It's just packets going through, and it's either lots of small packets for lots of small payments, or it's lots of small packets for a few big payments. But it's either way, it's lots of small packets. Multipathing, so if you have multiple ways to get through the liquidity graph. I didn't talk about that as much in this presentation, but I always think about these paths of liquidity as kind of a graph. And sometimes there is no direct connection between the 2 points. So for example, between Mexican pesos and Philippine pesos, I don't know if there's a liquid market between those two currencies. Probably not. You probably have to go to some other intermediate currency, whether it's the US dollar or something else. And then you can go from there to your destination. And so you can extend that however you want. Like one example that was in an earlier version of the presentation is like if I have a motorcycle and I want to have Philippine pesos, like a motorcycle in Mexico City, and I want to have Philippine pesos in the Philippines, well, first step is probably selling the motorcycle, right? And so I have to walk this graph to my destination and figure it out. And it's oftentimes we have to do that ourselves in our heads, like you have to think about like, okay, is it better for me to sell the motorcycle here, convert it to Mexican pesos, and then send that with a remittance provider? Or should I ship the motorcycle to the Philippines and then sell it there for Philippine pesos? Those are two perfectly valid options, and you have to kind of make the trade-off and figure out which one actually works. So in Interledger, a lot of that is kind of done by the protocol. Like the protocol looks at the paths and it tries to find the most efficient path. And multipathing just means you can take advantage of multiple paths at the same time. So you can like, I don't know, what's the example? Like if you have 2 motorcycles and you only have a buyer for one of them, so you could sell them the one motorcycle and then the other one shipped to the Philippines, and you're taking multiple paths to your destination at the same time. So Interledger does that transparently background. You never have to think about it. And we're able to do that because of packetization. If the payment was one event, we couldn't use multiple paths. We could use one path. Also, packetization helps with signaling. So if you're doing a big payment, it's no longer just one big payment that goes in and then gets stuck in a queue somewhere. It actually starts, and you start to move money. And so liquidity providers along the path will notice, oh, there's volume, there's flow coming here. And so you might even be able to redeploy capital in certain circumstances towards where flows are happening as they're starting and as they're happening. So there's a sort of like instant response. And you can even go one step further, which is like, with some of these faster systems like cryptocurrencies and so on, you might be able to rebalance your liquidity while a payment is in progress. So within one payment, it's using up your liquidity, you rebalance, and it's using up the same liquidity again. So you can reuse the same capital multiple times for one payment, which again is not really something that you can do. People sometimes do it manually, where if you have to make a very large payment as a corporate or something like that, you might actually split it up into smaller payments for this reason, because then the people along the path have an easier time processing that. Risk reduction, again, I go into more detail in last year's presentation, but just very quickly. So when you have your payment split into little packets, if something goes wrong, it's not the whole payment that goes wrong. It's packet number 353 worth $50. So you're not losing out the $10 million that XYZ corporate was sending. You're losing that one packet. And so as a liquidity provider, it kind of smooths out your risk. You're not constantly going between everything's great and total catastrophe, we lost all of our capital. It's more of a predictable, smooth event where like, oh, 1 in 10,000 payments fails, so we charge 0.01% to cover that. So with all of that, that's sort of all the theory out of the way. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some practical things and how I implement that in Dasi and how I think about it. So in Dasi, it's a peer-to-peer network. So each of these white circles could be you. You could run a Dasi node. You could connect to someone else running a Dasi node. Fair warning, it's a total prototype. It's completely broken. But hey, it's your own free time. I don't judge. So you peer with other people. And the way that you actually get liquidity is that you have what we call a payment channel. So that's basically like both sides have some capital. They kind of pre-fund it specifically for this counterparty, and then you can send money back and forth through that channel. And so you have to, for each person you want to peer with, take a bucket of money and put it towards that person. And of course, that can lead to a problem when, let's say you send a bunch of payments this way, and you run out of that 1 millibitcoin that you have pre-funded here, and you want to send more, but you can't, because this payment channel is now out of liquidity, right? But you still have 1 millibitcoin down here, but you can't really use it. You can only use it if you want to send that way, right? And so, excuse me. And so your liquidity is kind of tied to who you're dealing with. And this has a parallel in the traditional financial system. This is the same issue that banks had when they had Nostra-Vostra accounts with each other. And the solution in the banking world was clearinghouses or central bank clearing, real-time gross settlement, all those advancements. And so it's not that crazy to think, like, could we do something similar in a peer-to-peer Interledger context? Could we have sort of a clearinghouse? So again, we have our nodes, and they're paired with each other. And so what I'm introducing is this idea of liquidity neighborhoods or Interledger neighborhoods. Thank you, Brianna, for coming up with the title. I like that term a lot. And so the way that it works is that all the people that are part of a neighborhood, they use kind of a shared ledger. So they basically run a little mini consensus protocol, kind of like a blockchain, and then they can put collateral into that neighborhood. And so instead of my 2 millibitcoins being split between my 2 peering relationships, I now just have it available for anyone in this neighborhood. And so my liquidity efficiency goes up dramatically. I mean, in this case, I only have 2 peering connections, so it goes up 2x. But if I had 10 peers, it could go up as much as 10x. And then there's another advantage to this, which is now that we're in a neighborhood, we actually don't have to peer at all, because within the neighborhood, we don't have to trust anyone else, because this consensus ledger takes care of that. And so instead of peering explicitly for people, we can implicitly peer everyone who's in the same neighborhood. So everyone who's in the same neighborhood is now connected and can route packets to each other. And that, again, increases efficiency, because now I have additional paths available that I didn't have available before. Another problem that existed prior to this idea was what we call an uplink. So an uplink is basically you want to connect to the Interledger network, and so you run a DASI node, and now you want to connect to the network, and you need to kind of start somewhere, right? And so what we would do in the past is we would say, OK, I'm going to pick some node in the network, and I'm going to create a payment channel with them, and I'm going to fund it with some liquidity, and now I can transact with that one node. But of course, that creates a bottleneck. If that node doesn't forward your packets, your connection goes down immediately. And the nice thing about neighborhoods is that, well, I can just join a neighborhood now. So instead of peering with a specific node, I just join some neighborhood that looks good and that uses the currency that I'm interested in using. And so I'm implicitly peered with everyone in the neighborhood. And if one of them doesn't forward my packets, I can instantly switch to someone else. I don't need to first withdraw my liquidity and then redeposit it. So it's a lot more efficient once again. Just quickly explaining how cross-currency works with neighborhoods. So this is the old picture with bilateral relationships. So you could have this DASI node here is paired with that DASI node up there. And then that DASI node is paired with that one, but in a different currency. And so because this node has these different relationships and different currencies, it can actually take in a packet from here, convert the amount, and then send out the packet over here. And that's how currency conversion happens in Interledger. And if we apply this neighborhoods idea, this is what it looks like. So you basically have the 2 neighborhoods, and then people have money funded in the neighborhood that they're in. And if they're in multiple neighborhoods, then they have liquidity in each setup. And then, of course, I want to explain how it actually works to rebalance. So one of the things that might happen is like, OK, so you have your nodes. And now let's say there's some payments that are processed by this node going this way, and some payments that are processed by this node going that way. And so their liquidity gets unbalanced, right? So this guy is accumulating Bitcoin, but he's running out of XRP. This guy's running out of XRP and running out of Bitcoin and accumulating XRP. And so what they could do, since they have this shared neighborhood, what they can do is they can just rebalance with each other. So within the neighborhoods, you can kind of use this circular path to rebalance. So now we're back in even. Now, of course, you're going to say, that's a bit contrived. Why were the payments like perfectly balanced? That's not going to happen. So what happens if all the payments are just going one way? Everyone's accumulating Bitcoins, so everyone ends up with a lot of Bitcoins. Well, this thing that's still interesting is that you could have one of the nodes that has a relationship with a crypto exchange externally, and so they can use that to trade back so that they have the right allocation, and then they can help other nodes in those neighborhoods settle. So you could be a node that doesn't do what could be a fairly complicated work of integrating with exchanges and stuff, and you basically just passively sit here providing liquidity as you have it. And the way I'm thinking about it is in the blockchain world, there are these things called decentralized exchanges, and they are obviously running on the blockchain, so they're kind of passive. And so the way that they manage liquidity is just by incentive. So they calculate a price for like an exchange rate, essentially, that takes the liquidity into account. And so if their liquidity gets very unbalanced, they basically just charge an exchange rate that incentivizes people to rebalance it. And so by doing that, you can have these nodes that are just sitting there totally passively, no integration to any liquidity provision, very easy for somebody to run one. And then someone else who just wants to make some money, basically, can come in and can rebalance everybody's nodes for them. And I think that's a pretty interesting little simplification. And then everything's perfectly balanced again. All right, this slide is purely for Roberto, because he said I have such beautiful slides or whatever. This slide has absolutely no point. But he said I make slides that look really cool, so I had to make a slide that looks really cool. So this is for you, Roberto. I don't know where you are. Right there. Hi. So the way I envision these neighborhoods is that they would be regional, and that's really important because I want these little consensus ledgers to run very fast. Because they will have to reach consensus at each hop of an Interledger packet. Okay, so as an Interledger packet goes from one node to another, each node will have to get to consensus within its neighborhood before it can process that packet. And so you're adding a lot of latency if these ledgers are slow. Now, there are physical limits to how fast you can make a consensus ledger. And again, I don't want to get super technical in this case, but working on global ledgers, I worked on XRP, I worked on Bitcoin, there is sort of a fundamental speed limit of a couple of seconds for a ledger close, and that's just based on the speed of light and the circumference of the Earth. Like you can't, that's just like, you can't reach everyone much faster than that. And you have to have a certain number of round trips to do consensus. So those are fundamental physical limits. And so the way you get around that is you say the neighborhoods are actually somewhat geographically local, right? And again, I don't know if that's going to mean placing them at the intersection of several countries, so you can still have some jurisdictional decentralization, or if it just means like everybody rents a server in the same Amazon data center. I don't know. That's kind of for users to figure out how they want to do it. But the idea is to be within 10 milliseconds of latency of each other, so you can close ledgers within like 40, 50 milliseconds, so that you don't add very much latency to each hop of a Interledger packet. They would be consensus-based, which means that if one of the members of the neighborhood turns out to be malicious, tries to steal everyone's money, they can't. There's a quorum-based system. We might do something similar to what blockchains do with some kind of proof of stake or something like that. So the more liquidity you have invested in the neighborhood, the more of a say you have in its governance. But again, you can go a lot of different ways with this. It's just an idea at this point. So I already mentioned that they're low latency. And that's it. Thank you. And this QR code down here is this is the donation page for the Philippine Red Cross. So if you want to prove your payments acumen, you can try to send them money. And good luck, and let me know how it goes. I would have time for some questions, or? Sure. Let me know if there are any questions. Otherwise, I can get out of your hair. Anybody got any questions? Oh, I see one. I see a question back there. Yep.
Thank you. This idea of liquidity neighborhood seems really nice, but then there's like two ways of thinking liquidity in that process, right? One is the money that the entities actually have, let's say in the specific currency that you need to manage the process, right? And the other one, let's call it virtual liquidity, which is what you're agreeing to keep always available. I mean, with central banks, it can be 10, 15, 20%, depending on the payment system, or the credit note. Are you seeing both sides as working in this model? And I'm asking because it's a mutualist system, right? So if you think it on the one side, you think of the liquidity of the entire model. But that can be very unfair because you don't have rules where each one has to keep a certain percentage or a certain legal capacity in case of failure to cover that, right? So you cannot ask all of them to have exactly the same level of risk when one can be managing billions and the other one maybe 20 millions. It's a completely different structure. So how do you think this neighborhood liquidity idea, I mean, I know it's an idea, but it's a powerful idea, and as such, it has very specific paths where it can go.
Yeah. So I love that you asked that question because it's actually something I think about a lot, which is, you know, you can come at this problem from these very different perspectives. I very much have a background in cryptocurrency and blockchain. And in that world, very often when you're talking about collateralization, you have 100% collateral. There's no credit at all. And the reason is that you don't want somebody to create an anonymous identity, join the system, build up some credit, and then steal that money and leave and never pay it back because they're anonymous, right? Now, I think that because liquidity efficiency is so important, I think it is actually very important for people who want to build decentralized peer-to-peer systems to think about how can we create trust. Like, I'm not one of those people who thinks that everything should be trustless. I think trust is valuable. And I think that if we could make trustworthy decentralized systems, that would be awesome, and we should do that. I think for like a first prototype, I would probably go fully collateralized. And so I'm not sure if that answers your question around fairness, but like essentially in an early iteration, you would probably ask everybody to fund how much money they want to fund, and that's how much they can process. But down the road, I think it'd be very interesting to say, for example, if you have processed a certain amount of money historically through the system, other nodes will start to trust you for that amount, you know, or like for a fraction of that amount. And then that way you could sort of build trust over time. And you know, if the incentives work out, maybe people will not abuse that trust. So lots of room for experimentation. I don't have all the answers there. Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. So similar to Roberto's question, I mean, it's all on liquidity. So particularly, so if you look at the hard currencies, say USD to GBP or Euro, you'll find that it's super efficient. CLS does a great job. So when we look at these neighborhoods, we're thinking of two currencies that are not quite equal. So USD on one side, and just say like a Malawian kwacha on the other side. And say, you know, you're trying to settle between a trade between Malawi and Zambia, except there's a huge trade imbalance between those two countries. So no one really wants these Malawian kwachas. And that's like a fundamental problem that's kind of the sticking point of trade in Africa. Just any thoughts on how a liquidity neighborhood could potentially solve something like that?
Yeah, I think that what you correctly point out is that there are nodes that are ultra liquid. Like you can't even comprehend the kinds of numbers that are going between, you know, euros and dollars, or you know, dollars and yuan. You know, and so the way I think about that is, where there is a lot of volume, it's already driving plenty of competition to drive down the cost, to make it worthwhile for liquidity providers to provide liquidity. And the problems arise when there isn't enough volume, maybe the payments are higher risk, and so the costs start to rise relative to the volume. And I think that how this stuff may help, and again, I always try to be humble. Like I try to be like, hey, this is a proposal. I can't promise it'll solve anything, but the way I think it might help is that by lowering the risks, I mentioned like by having packetization, we can kind of lower the risk a little bit. By having the liquidity be universal, so we don't have to have liquidity dedicated to remittances, for example, versus other types of payments. We can kind of make it so that the overall volume is bigger, so it's maybe a bit more worthwhile to be a liquidity provider in this network. And I hope that it creates sort of these nice positive externalities, right? Where like, there will be a big bank that creates a corridor into this country because they want to service corporate payments, but because the liquidity is universal, oops, like, remittances are now cheaper too. I think that's sort of the, call it a Trojan horse, or, like I think that's kind of what happened with the internet too, where people built the infrastructure, maybe not thinking about people in rural areas, maybe not people thinking about people who are underserved, but for themselves. And then once the infrastructure is in place, it's universal infrastructure, so everything can ride on it. I think that's really what I would push everyone to drive towards, and like that's my only idea for how to solve that.
Following on from that, one of the things we're looking at the moment is we're engaged in payments in Africa. And one of the things we want to do is to bring the current cash money changers into a digital world and to allow them to provide liquidity generally, not just to people who happen to be on the bus they're on, but to anybody who might want that liquidity. Now, this sounds like a very interesting potential synergy. It's early days for us in thinking about it, but I would very much like to get together with you and see if we can work out something that would bring these things together.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Going once. All right, thank you very much. That's it.